Megan called me at the very moment I was deeply immersed in work. I didn't have time to talk and wanted to cut her off without listening, especially when she hesitated for a few seconds before speaking. Just as I was about to tell her I didn't have time, she began to sob. Everything else instantly faded away in the face of my daughter's obvious pain. "Megan, what's wrong, sweetheart? Tell me." I felt helpless listening to the agony in her sobs. Had someone died, I wondered, or had her boyfriend left her? Could she be pregnant? Endless possibilities of pain swirled through my mind like clothes in a dryer. "Oh, Daddy," Megan whimpered, "we need to talk." We. Could she really be pregnant? I thought. "All right, I'll come home right now," I began. And no, my daughter insisted. "We need to meet somewhere far from Mom." That was unexpected. My wife was usually the one my kids turned to for everything. "All right," I repeated, "just tell me where and when." We'd agreed to meet at the lake in the park after work. "We love you, Daddy," she said sadly before hanging up. The rest of the day at work, I was completely useless. I couldn't stop thinking about Megan. "We love you, Daddy." Her voice sounded so sorrowful. Why did her words affect me so deeply? And who were we? Her and her brother and sister. Her and a loved one. I couldn't focus on anything. Joanna and I had met when I was on shore leave in San Diego back in 2005. Joanna worked as a waitress while putting herself through college. I was a passionate sailor lucky enough to form a connection with a woman who was remarkable. Too good for the dingy bar where men constantly harassed her. Long story short, I spent my entire leave with Joanna, and after a brief naval deployment, I returned to San Diego with a firm intention to make her mine forever. We walked to Vegas, got married, and were just about to enjoy a beautiful honeymoon when my ship received orders to head to the Persian Gulf. I moved Joanna back to my small hometown, where my parents owned a little rental house they let us stay in. I tried to introduce her to some of my friends before rushing back to San Diego for duty, but she didn't seem to connect with them. They were too straightforward for Joanna. In San Diego, she was used to a more interesting crowd. I figured it was because she went to college there, so my small-town friends were probably too reserved for her. I felt uneasy leaving her in an unfamiliar place without any friends besides my parents. But her first letter put my mind at ease. She had met a woman named Monica and seemed to bond with her instantly. Joanna was that kind of person. Just look at how quickly we connected. In her letter, she wrote about how much she missed me but mentioned being busy with Monica, her partner Bucky, and their friends. She seemed happy, though I still felt guilty for not being there for her. However, during my second month in the Persian Gulf, I received joyous news. Joanna was pregnant. Apparently, our farewell had left its mark. Now Joanna wouldn't be alone anymore. I got lucky shortly after Megan was born, as I was sent back to the States for training on an updated radar system. Joanna and Megan were able to visit me occasionally at the school. I fell in love with my daughter the moment I laid eyes on her. And of course, I loved my wife as well. There were many moments to cherish before I had to return to my ship. During my second month in the Persian Gulf, I received joyous news again. Joanna was pregnant once more. Diana was a determined baby. She waited until the 42nd week to make her arrival. We were worried about the possibility of complications, but Joanna seemed strong and resilient. I was stuck in the Gulf of Mexico when Diana was finally born. By the time I returned to the States, I spent a week at home before heading back to San Diego to complete my discharge paperwork. When I got back home, I was able to accompany my newly pregnant wife to her first LeMays class. Ian burst into our lives, arriving at 38 weeks. Joanna was busy with the kids and spent a lot of time with my now retired parents. I asked my mom what had become of Monica and her friends. "Over the last few months, I've barely seen them," my mom told me. "You know, when you have kids, it's hard not to drift away from your single friends. I think Joanna just settled down, that's all. She doesn't have many new friends, really. Everyone she knows now has kids." Joanna, the kids, and I started living an idyllic life in my hometown. I was able to use my Navy education to secure a job as an engineer at the local television station. It was a well-paying position, and over the next 12 years, I worked my way up to department head. We had a wonderful life with healthy, active kids. What could have gone wrong? What did go wrong? I thought, waiting by the lake. I had arrived early and felt incredibly nervous. The waiting only made my anxiety worse. Then came the tight hugs given by all three of my kids. Tears welled up in their eyes, and it seemed like none of them could bring themselves to look me in the eye. Megan led me to a bench in the park. I sat between my daughters while my son stood nearby. Diana took one of my hands in hers and rested her head on my shoulder. She was crying. "Dad," Megan gathered her courage and began, "We love you. You're our dad always." She couldn't hold it together and started crying again. My God, what was going on? My own breathing was becoming erratic. She tried again. "Dad, my class was given an assignment to create a family tree, and I thought I could get more information by sending our DNA to 23andMe. She wiped her eyes. Cousin Elizabeth told me about her family's results, and I thought it would be a great surprise for you and Mom, so I sent in my data, Diana's and Ian's. I struggled to breathe. My mind was consumed with one thought, where this might lead, and I didn't want to hear what I feared she was about to say. Dad, we're not your children. Megan looked at me with the saddest expression I had ever seen. I shook my head. Wait a minute, you didn't have my DNA. So what makes you think you're not mine? I almost laughed in relief. Whatever the kids thought, this had to be a mistake. Dad, the results show everyone you're connected to. They show all of Mom's relatives on her maternal side, but on the paternal side there are tons of people we don't know. Most of them are European. That made my blood run cold. I tried to figure out how the kids could have gotten the correct version of Jonah's DNA, but not mine. Is it the same for all three of you? This threw me off. How could it be? Yes, and we're all full siblings. Diana squeezed my hand tightly. You're our daddy. You're our daddy. She buried her face in my chest. Ian looked miserable, like he wanted to cry, but was trying hard to stay strong. He sniffled and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I listened to my daughter's quiet sobs and the sound of my son scuffing the ground with his boot. Finally, I spoke. Give me the reports from 23andMe. Kids, would you mind going to the movies or somewhere else tonight? Maybe even staying out overnight. Let me talk to your mother. I hugged the girls tightly, holding them close. Ian shook my hand, trying to be brave despite the tears in his eyes. They agreed to spend the night at a friend's house. Megan handed me the reports, and as they turned to leave, I stopped them. All three turned back and looked at me. I am your father, no matter what. It doesn't matter what these reports say. There's no one else. I forced a smile. You are my kids, and I couldn't wish for better. I kissed them again and held them tightly, then was left alone. I went through the reports. There was no mistake. They were clearly Jonah's children, but they weren't mine. I didn't recognize a single name on the paternal side. All my relatives, including my sister and her family, were absent. I drove home to uncover the truth. Joanna was cooking dinner but turned around when I walked in. She opened her arms, ready to greet me with a hug and a kiss, as usual. She froze, arms wide open, the moment she saw my face. What's wrong? I had never spoken to her so coldly before. Who's their father, Joanna? Her face turned pale, her eyes widening in panic. What? What are you talking about? Megan did 23andMe on all three of them, Joanna. I stepped closer and growled, who was their father? Joanna backed up to a chair and sat down. Ian must be yours, she muttered, staring at the floor and shaking her head. Bullshit. Ian matches both girls. He's their full brother. Who did you sleep with? Are you still seeing him? I was losing control. My fists were clenched, my arms pressed tightly against my sides to keep myself from hitting her. This is impossible, Jim. It's impossible, Joanna said, shaking her head. She started to stand, but I grabbed her and shoved her back into the chair. She flinched and looked at me with fear in her eyes. You're going to sit right there and tell me what happened, or I'll have to confront you. Her fear grew as my threat hung in the air. I was in so much pain and so angry that I might have actually hit her. For a moment, she stared at me, then dropped her head into her hands, defeated. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet I could barely hear her. It was so long ago, I suddenly found myself in this backwater town, all alone. I loved you, but you were gone. Your friends were so boring. But then I met Monica, and she took me to the local bars. She had substances, the same kind they had in the clubs in San Diego. She sniffled and looked up at me. I was 19. I was used to partying. I loved you, but you left me here. Monica and Bucky were fun. We had a great time, relaxed, had drinks. You hadn't even been gone 2 weeks when I woke up with Bucky. Then there were his other friends. I don't know who the father was, but it was probably one of them. She looked at me with desperation in her eyes. I prayed that you were the father. I really did. You could have been. We were close all the time before you left. She lowered her gaze to the floor, admitting her defeat. Damn it. I was stunned. You couldn't stay faithful to me for even 2 weeks, and you were involved with so many guys you don't even know who might be the father of the child. I stood up and slammed both fists on the table. Are you kidding me? You're a liar. Joanna shrank back into the chair. I didn't plan to be with them. We were having fun, and then I woke up. They took advantage of me. Oh, sure, you fought them off so well that over the next 3 years, you resisted at least 2 more times. I wanted to pound the table until I broke my hands. I wanted to grab a chair and smash it against the fridge. I wanted to hurt Joanna. I wanted to hurt myself. No. My wife stood up and walked to the sink to get a glass of water, maybe just to put some distance between us. No, I fought back. but Monica had a tape. She threatened to show it to your parents if I didn't keep hanging out with her. She said gatherings were more fun with two girls. Gatherings. How many guys did you see? I didn't want to know. Why did I ask? Bucky threw 1 or 2 parties every week, each time with 5 or 6 guys. Sometimes there were more, and Monica joined us, but usually it was just me. I tried to manage it. I used protection, but when you were home, I must have messed up. She looked at me again. But I hoped they were yours. I convinced myself they were. Joanna returned to the table and sat down. For a moment, she stared at me, lost in her thoughts. I should have resisted more. I should have hated it. She shook her head in disbelief. But you know I love being with others. You were everything I needed. That's why I married you. I didn't need anyone else. She looked at me sadly. But you weren't here. And maybe Monica's influence was the excuse I needed, so I decided that if I had to be with others, I might as well enjoy it. She caught the look on my face. I know this hurts you, but I want to be honest. Yes, they influenced me, pressured me, and took advantage of me, but eventually I accepted it. She started sobbing again. You weren't here. You weren't here. I needed you. I went to clubs with Monica, and she encouraged me to go to the parking lot with her friends. We were intimate in the back seat of Monica's car, or in Bucky's van, or in some guy's car if Monica had hers. Then came the group gatherings. It usually happened on Saturdays. Every time you came home, I refused to attend the gatherings Monica and Bucky arranged. I didn't go to the clubs with Monica. You were everything I needed. She looked at me with fear and tears in her eyes. I made sure you never even met Monica or Bucky. You didn't even notice. You were always either with the girls or with me. Speaking of the girls, where were Megan and Diana while you were having your fun? I sneered at this unfaithful woman who was the mother of my children. Your mom liked watching them. She knew I was lonely here. I've never lived in a town this small like you have. I was used to parties and excitement in San Diego. I was used to sailors approaching me and showing interest in me. She lowered her head and began to sob. Damn it, I got used to being taken advantage of. I was stunned. Now my wife was looking at me as if this were somehow my fault. I wanted to lash out in return. So, are you still associating with Monica, or do you have a new partner? Joanna gave a crooked smile. Nice choice of words. At the gatherings, I thought I was being casual just for fun. Then, one night, just before you came back from the Gulf for good, Monica got sick, and I went to the club alone since I'd already dropped the kids off with your mom. She shook her head and winced. I wasn't forced to go to the club, but by that point, I was already going on my own and giving myself away. Anyway, one of the regulars was there, and I went with him to his car. After he was done, I was getting dressed when he handed me some cash. I asked him what it was for, and he said that since Monica and Bucky weren't there, he thought he should give it to me. They're usually the ones who take the money. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just the person I thought I was. I was involved in inappropriate activities. Tears started streaming down her face again. I thought I had low self-esteem, but that night I found out I was even lower than I thought. She looked me in the eyes for a few moments before continuing. That's when I told Monica and Bucky to go away. I threatened to go to the police, even if it meant I'd be arrested for inappropriate activities. You were supposed to come home within a month. I just wanted to spend my life with you. Her face twisted with emotion. I only wanted you. A month? That doesn't explain Ian. I can't explain Ian. Bucky insisted on one last time, but I used protection and made him wear a condom. I was sure Ian was yours. I sat silently for a few minutes. We stared at each other without saying a word. I thought about the years we had spent together, wondering if it had ever really been just us, or if there had always been others involved. Then it hit me, 2 weeks. 2 weeks alone, and she was already involved with Bucky. That's when I realized I would never trust her again. Pack your things, say goodbye to the kids, and leave my life. Maybe I could have forgiven you if you told me when you first woke up with Bucky, but how can I trust someone who admits to having been involved with others for years? Even when you didn't have to, you couldn't wait to be with others. But since that last time with Bucky, it's only been you. I've always been faithful. She saw the look in my eyes. There was no coming back from this. She choked back a sob, stood up, and left the room to pack her things. I walked out of the house. Later, I learned that she had packed most of her clothes and left. I don't know where she stayed, but she came back the next day while I was at work. She wanted to try explaining everything to the kids. They weren't kind to her. Megan, in particular, was extremely hostile. My neighbor later told me that Megan had thrown her mother out of the house, calling her a liar. Megan shouted at her to go do her activities somewhere else while the neighbors came out to see what the commotion was, and Diana and Ian watched everything unfold from the porch. We never saw Joanna again. She went to the bank and withdrew most of our savings. She left me the investment accounts, so in the end, I still had more than half of our assets, not including the house. I didn't know where to serve her divorce papers, so I just waited the 2 years necessary to file for disappearance. My mother had loved Joanna like a daughter. She loved my kids even more. I was afraid to tell her about Joanna's past and the unknown, though likely Bucky, parentage of the children. I sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee as I broke the bad news. Her face contorted in shock as she wept at the horror of it all. And the kids, they're not yours. The DNA shows that. Yes, apparently, they're related to a bunch of Swedes. Most of their relatives are in Sweden. Mom snapped her head up. What? They matched with your DNA. I explained that we never ran my DNA test, but it wasn't necessary. My kids should have matched with my sister and her children. My mother shook her head in disbelief. I never thought it would matter. That's why we never told you. I really thought it wouldn't matter. You're my son. I didn't understand what she was saying. I was her son. Wasn't I my father's son? My children should have matched with my sister's DNA. Mom, what are you talking about? She looked at me with something close to pity. Son, you were adopted. We had a Swedish housemaid for your sister who became pregnant. We wanted a son, so we adopted you. Your biological mother returned to Sweden after you were born. You were our son, so we never told you about it. Well, I went and took a DNA test, and it matched with all 3 of my children. They were mine. As I mentioned before, we never saw Joanna again. I don't know what happened to her and never got the chance to tell her that I was the father of her children. But did it matter? If it weren't for the DNA results not matching my relatives, I would never have discovered my wife's past and would probably have remained happily married. But now, could I forget her past even though the kids were mine? No. It all comes down to the fact that 2 weeks was the limit of her marital fidelity, and the fact that even if she was influenced at first, she admitted to embracing the life Monica and Bucky provided for her. As I tell my kids now, who would have thought that marrying a waitress from a dive bar in San Diego would turn out this way? Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.